Good afternoon. Econ 355, the History of Economic Thought 1. Here we go. Let's see. The first thing I want to do is remind you that the term papers are due, if you haven't turned it in already, and I've got some, on Thursday. Usual time, so just submit it by whatever is the most convenient means. You can drop it off, at my office. You can email it to me. Remember that I need I also want the rough draft with my markups on it. And so you can just scan it and send it, or you can send, email one, drop the other, whatever, however works best. Drop one at the office, something. Let's see, what else? I will be sure you check out, I'm going to keep the videos coming for these lectures. And I'll even tell you what we're going to be doing. I'm going to talk about Ricardo. We'll finish Ricardo today. These are the subjects I'm going to cover, which are we're going to review, talk about his Korn model, talk about his labor theory of value that he develops, and then talk about how all this kind of comes together to form the law of comparative advantage. And I think it's a pretty important and interesting stuff that he generates from this, even though some of it is clearly wrong. The labor theory of value in particular. We'll talk about that. Subsequent lectures are going to cover the development of classical economics, which is really underway with Ricardo. And then we will talk about, we'll talk about people like James Mill a little bit, maybe a little bit about Nassau Sr., I've got him here, and maybe Jean-Baptiste Say or a few others. We will cover John Stuart Mill as being kind of the highest development of classical economics. Henry Thornton, I'll cover Thornton because I want to do classical monetary economics, and Thornton is really good. And there's one other thing, it doesn't work, I'll try and make it work. It works a lot better in person because I get weird reactions from people. But, well, it depends. I'll try to get the reaction now. I was talking to I have a friend who is a professor at a major university outside of Michigan, who was looking at the Hillsdale College catalog and saying, wow, this looks like really good programs. Look, this is pretty good. Wow, it's quite the place, but where's the women's studies program? I said, well, look on page 247. History of Economic Thought? Yeah, of course. So I'm going to talk about as far as I can tell, the first women to be in economics. It just struck me that maybe it has women's studies here, whatever. So I will probably do a little lecture on that as well. What other things? There might be if I think of something else that I just think sounds like fun, I'll just make a video and put it up. And those are going to be on YouTube. They will be go to the quarantine protocols on the Blackboard site. We'll have the link, so be sure you follow the lectures. Final exams, I have not gotten any word. Where I think the idea is to get back and do everything as normal in the classroom as quickly as possible. Hopefully before December 8th. That's what the deadline has been, but maybe we'll get some kind of, legal action or maybe something will break and we'll get back here. But I will, for now, not make any plans about finals. We'll just we'll make it work, whatever happens, one way or another, okay? Good. I have to say that I don't like not teaching here because the only reason I'm in Hillsdale is because of the opportunity to teach you guys. I've taught all over the world, 4 countries, and I'd rather teach here than any place else I've been, just from the standpoint of the classroom. The only reason I live in the Midwest is for this. I would be in the Rocky Mountains, or I'd be in some exotic foreign land. I would not be in the Midwest. No offense to those of you who live in the Midwest, but I don't know why you live in a place with no mountains, no vodka, what's the deal here? All right, well, let's get it back to serious stuff. I don't know. I guess, actually, Ugly Dog vodka is made over in Chelsea, and it's pretty, never mind. All right, we were at the Korn model last time, and I want to pick up there and talk about it, because what Ricardo is doing is, Ricardo is a model builder, and he thinks in terms of long-run equilibria, and he's building a model of the entire British economy built on what he has been generating in terms of insights, built on Smith, Malthus, and now based on his own insights. And so this is a model of the whole economy. And let's just go ahead and revisit that. So Ricardo's corn model. And I thought I had these markers a little better, I think. So his corn model. And again, it starts out with the agricultural sector. So we've got the ag sector here. And I'm going to put average product of labor, marginal product of labor on this axis. And on this axis, the population, the labor supply, L. Okay, great. And we know that we have a falling average product of labor, and halfway would be a falling marginal product of labor. Why is it falling? Put this in first of all. Why is it falling? Because of diminishing returns on the intensive margin and the extensive margin. As we expand agriculture, we're having to go into less fertile stuff and also be using more intensively the land that we already were using, and so we get falling product, right? Right, we already went through that with the chart last time. Okay, great. Next thing we'll put in is the subsistence wage. So I'll just say W sub for subsistence wage, and we'll draw that across there. Great, okay. And then we'll have to figure out what the population at the point is, and there is the starting population at times 0, L naught. So there's that. And how does he argue what is going on here? Red marker. Great. Well, given that population, here's what we would see happening. Okay, great. They can produce, there's the average product per worker. Oh, one other thing I should say before I continue with that. This L naught actually, in his thinking, is actually not just labor. It's labor and capital. It's a man with a unit of capital or unit of labor and a unit of capital. A man with shovels assumption, or a man with a hoe or a plow or whatever it is. And so, I'll do it in black right now, make it show up better. And so that is L naught units of labor and capital. He imagines them both being used together. Okay, great. Well, how do we analyze this? Well, first of all, the total output, the total product of labor and capital, is equal to the average product times the amount of labor, right? And so it must be that times that. It must be that box right there. There's the average product of labor given that. That total box right there is the total output in the agricultural sector. How does it get split up? And he says, well, this is the variable input. We can change the amount of that we use. And so that variable input will earn its marginal product. There's the marginal product of labor and capital. How does it get split between labor and capital? Well, there's the wage rate. So the remainder must be the rate of profit. Okay? And so this must be the wage bill. This whole thing is the total. This must be the profit here, this box. And this, what's this? Rents, okay? Rent is what is left over. So marginal product of labor times labor is equal to that. It'll be equal to the wage bill plus the total profit. And that means that rent is what is left over. That is, it is, as he puts it, residual. It's a residual, it's just left over. Okay? Great, make sense? Everyone's clear on how we analyze this? Questions? Okay, great. All right, so Suppose that, well, not suppose, what happens next? Well, profit is positive. Therefore, capitalists will buy more capital, invest, reinvest because they're making a profit. And when they buy more capital, what does that do? It requires them to hire more workers. The demand for workers goes up, so the wage goes up. Wage goes up because of that. And what does that do? The wage goes up, it goes above subsistence, population expands until the wage goes back down, right? Back to subsistence. So let's look at the next equilibrium position. Maybe we expand to, I don't know, L1. And now we're at a spot like that. So now what has happened? Okay, there is marginal product of labor 1, APL 1. So that right there is the total product of labor, or that right there is the total amount earned by the capital and labor. That's the wage bill. That must be the, that must be the profit right there. Profit, wage bill, and the rent. And what has happened? The rate of profit has fallen, kind of like Adam Smith said, as capital expands, the rate of profit should fall. And rent has gotten bigger. Rent has expanded. This keeps going until what point? It keeps going until here. And at this point, which I guess we'll call L star, the equilibrium, at that point, our wage bill and our rent and at this point, profit is 0. Profit 0 at that point. And so profit 0, this stops. That's the long run equilibrium. And at that point, we are actually at what Adam Smith calls the stationary stage. This has been an expanding, growing economy. We get to here, it's now at the stationary stage. No further investment, no further growth. Okay? And that's the long run position of this economy. Great. That's his analysis. All right. Questions so far? He notes a couple of things about this. This process is now stopped. And at the stationary state, we have wages at subsistence, profit is at 0, and the rent has been maximized. The rent is as big as it can possibly be. And the rate of investment, rate of profit at 0, landlord rent maximized, means that, as Ricardo puts it, the interest of the landlord is contrary to the interest of everybody else in this society. The landlord is really happy with this because that's his best possible position, but for other people, it's not. Okay, profits at 0, wages subsistence, and we're just there for the rest of forever. And remember, when he makes this argument, he is a landowner. He's purchased land, and he says, I own it, I benefit from it, but I'm not doing anything really.
So the rent goes to the landowner. Where's the profit go?
Capitalist, the person who owns the capital, who owns the shovel, who is probably employing the laborers. Imagine it this way: the landowner has got the land, and landowner has the land. Capitalist rents the land from the landowner and then hires the laborers, gives them units of capital to work with, and then reaps profit. Okay, and then at some point that all stops. Okay. Oh man, kettlebells. At any rate, so. But hang on a second. This is the agricultural sector. What about the manufacturing sector? He's told the story here. But what about manufacturing? Because it's a two-sector model, so we have to think about this. And we don't have, There is a graph I can draw, and I will do it in a second, but the basic analysis is pretty simple. Ricardo says, look, again, think about the long run equilibrium. Suppose that one market has a high, so one sector of the economy has a high rate of profit and one has a low rate of profit. What happens? Everybody takes capital out of the low rate of profit and moves it to the high rate of profit sector, right? So that can't be a long run equilibrium. As they move, it goes like until they are equal. So the rates of profit should be equal in both sectors, okay? Great, that's the first thing. Well, it looks like that means we're going to expand until we hit a zero profit condition in both places, zero profit. And that's what Adam Smith has basically suggested, because he said that if we expand the amount of capital in an economy, the rate of profit drops and it drops and it drops, and it'll eventually get to the point where it's zero. And then we're at the long run equilibrium for both sectors. And so we could think of it this way. If I will do this one in terms of output instead of input, this is how the classicals generally see it. It's the quantity of manufactured stuff. And they see it as being a constant cost industry. Okay? I'll just write that down. Manufacturing is constant cost. And so there's the cost of production. And they imagine you can always, if it costs, let's say it's $100 for the average unit of output. I don't know, we're making atlatls or something. And that's the cost of producing a unit of output. You can always produce more at that cost simply by building another factory that does the same thing. Just keep duplicating it. So they imagine you can always indefinitely expand production here. I'm going to throw in a demand curve. It doesn't matter where. Great. We're at total cost will be that marginal cost. There's the total cost of production. And there's the price. And, oh, looks like zero profit. That's how they imagine this. I think last time when I left off, I pointed out this agricultural sector has to be an increasing cost industry, because as we expand, it gets more costly to get another unit of output. That's the falling marginal product. So remember, marginal cost of output, marginal cost of output, as I said, would be equal to the wage rate divided by the marginal product of labor. Okay? Every time I hire another unit of labor, I get the marginal product at the cost of the wage rate, subsistence, and that thing must be getting smaller and smaller. That's getting bigger and bigger as we expand output. That is to say, here's the way it looks. Here's the way this graph would look in the agricultural sector, dollars per unit of output. I don't know if you can see that, making it kind of small. That would simply give us a marginal cost curve like that, increasing, and then you tell me what level of output we're at. If I take the marginal cost, add them all up, there's the total cost, and there's the rent, right? Price times quantity. Right? Make sense? Yes? No? Maybe? Okay, great. All right, well there's Ricardo's idea of the corn model. He's just laid out the entire English economy with this. And it's actually quite the I guess, clever answer to Smith's question. Remember what Smith was trying to do was say, there's the long run natural price, and it must be made up of the wages paid to the labor that goes into making the good, plus the rents for the land that goes into making the good, land and resources, plus the profits for the capital that goes into making the good. And now he's told us what determines each one of those things. He's got it laid out here. There's the rate of profit, depends on where we are. There's that's iron law, that's subsistence, that's right there. It'll end up being zero. And then that's the residual. Great. So in other words, this will be subsistence. That's the iron law of wages. And this one will be marginal product minus wages. And this one will be whatever is left over, a residual. Okay, great. I guess a few last details about this. If we have technological innovation, of course, that's going to push this up, and that will change where that stationary state sets in. But he thinks it's not a major thing that he studied. It's not a major effect. It's so it would shift those, but it's not the big story. And the other thing is that if we can raise the definition of subsistence by educating the poor or by the commoners, move it up here, we'll hit the stationary state sooner, but it'll be at a higher average wage rate. So we'll maybe a happier story. Okay, but that's the long run story as he sees it. Okay. All right, good. Good?
Good question.
Yeah.
Are profits residual or rents residual?
No. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you caught that because that's totally backwards. Profits are marginal product minus the wage rate. Then rents are the residual. Okay. That's important. Because Ricardo's argument is, look, that the land doesn't go. If I don't pay wages, how many people are going to work? Nobody. If I don't pay profit, who's going to provide capital? Nobody. And if I don't pay the rent, does the land go away? England will be the same size. It's more or less what the argument is. It doesn't affect the land that's available. Henry George will make that argument too at some point. So that this one really is not a factor payment. I suppose technically you could get rid of it. In fact, let's see what Ricardo says about that. Because Ricardo does say that. It's just a residual. It's just the landlord reaps where he never sowed. Because Ricardo then asks the question. He says, is it really cost of production? Because that's what this is still suggesting. Smith has said it, and I, Ricardo, think I've got it. But is it really cost of production, or is it something else? And he says, strictly speaking, the rents are residuals, so that's not a cost. But also, it's probably not wages. That doesn't seem like the factor, and here's why. He says wages should be the same across industries for the same reason the profits would be. Suppose that the wages are very high in this industry and very low in this industry. What happens? Everybody leaves. People start leaving this industry for the high wage industry, and they will. He says, wow, they should equate across industries. Wages should be about the same, controlling for skill or something like that. And so if wages are the same across industries, what does that tell us? And he puts it this way. Suppose that we have two industries. I'm going to call them very cleverly Industry 1 and Industry 2. And in Industry 1, they produce good 1. And in Industry 2, they produce good 2. Okay? Great. And we'll make the price, and the only thing that is used to produce these goods is labor. So I guess they're services or something, I don't know. But the price in Industry 1 will be equal to the wage rate in Industry 1 times the amount of labor that goes into making the good, right? If the wage rate is $2 and we use 5 units of labor, the price must be $10. That would be the long run price, right? Okay. And for good 2, price 2 is equal to W2 L2. So if it's $3 and 10 units of labor, $30. Great. Except what happens to the wage rates? Well, let's think about this. He says that the relative price for those goods, the relative price must be P1 over P2, one good in terms of another, which will be equal to W1 L1 over W2 L2. But if people adjust their labor supply so that the wage rates are equal across industries, that would mean that in equilibrium, W1 equals W2, which means that we can just do this, and that's equal to L1 over L2. Wow, the thing that determines the relative price is the relative labor input. Wow, cool. Adam Smith was right about the deer and beaver model. Go Adam Smith. Oh, hang on a second. We forgot about capital. All right, Ricardo says, so far so good. That looks like the deer and beaver model. Can we bring capital into the story? And he says, yes, I think we can. And here's how we do it. Get all this junk out of here. So our question then, his question is, what about capital? And he puts it this way. Suppose that we have, we take 100 units of labor. 100 units of labor, and we put that to work and we get 1 ton of wheat. Okay, those are farm workers and they can produce a ton of wheat in a year. Cool, okay? But we could instead put them to work and they would build the one machine. Okay, that is a unit of capital. Great. What do you think what's the relative price of those two things? Well, they each contain the same amount, 100 units. I bet 1 ton of wheat trades for 1 machine, right? Yes, right? Yes. Cool. Yeah, right? Yes. Makes sense. And suppose then that we do the following. 1 machine that cost us 100 units of labor. 100 units of labor plus 1 machine will make, let's say, 1,000 shirts. Okay, and then the machine is used up. It's expended. It's depreciated. It's used up. Okay, 1,000 shirts. Price of them in terms of wheat. Not quite the same, because that contains 100 units of labor that went into the machine plus 100 extra units of labor. That contains 200 units of labor, right? And so that must be like 2 tons of wheat, right? 2 to 1, deer and beaver. Adam Smith was right. Great. And it's correct. That's what he concludes. Capital for him is, you can call it stored labor or canned labor. Karl Marx calls it congealed labor. Great. But we can think of that unit of capital as just being comprised of the labor that went into making it. Add that to the labor that you use. Wow, the whole thing can be explained by the labor input into everything. Is that cool or what? Don't think it's too cool. It is sort of cool, but don't think it's too cool because it's wrong, as it turns out. But it's the labor theory of value. You can explain value for anything that is reproducible. Any reproducible good, the value is explained by the labor input. Right? Are you all ready to join the Marxist revolution? Well, we are always suspicious of you, but at any rate, all right. Well, I don't know. It's an interesting theory. He lays this out, and it is, and thinks that he has just generated the whole story here. Capital can labor. Adam Smith is right. Labor theory of value is what he has. It's a brilliant solution. And so here's the labor theory of value, and that's simply that. Labor theory of value is simply that for reproducible goods, the labor input determines relative price. And most classical economists tend to, I think it's fair to say most of them buy some version of something like this. They kind of think it's right. Are there any problems with it? What I've just laid up here is the weakest part, as it turns out. It's the fatal flaw in classical economics. What's wrong with it? Any criticisms? Does anyone have a criticism? The other group that doesn't even talk suddenly started talking when I said this. So you guys must have something to say. Joshua?
I mean, one of the problems with the theory of value, I guess, is simply like that does the amount of labor determine price? I mean,
No.
price seems to be
Good point.
The price is subjective. Like,
Okay.
I mean, so to just say, oh, objectively, this is what this costs. It's like the amount of time I put in for paper doesn't mean it's worth anything. You know, I mean, because I put a lot of labor before many people work on something, but it's not valuable. If value is subjective, then there is no, you can't objectively say, oh, well, this much labor went into it before it's worth this.
So I'm gonna give 4 complaints or four weaknesses of this. 2 of them are relevant because for our current lecture, but this comes later. Subjectivity of value, well, sort of comes later. I mean, some people recognize this at the time, but not everybody values something the same way. Ricardo's response would be, look, we're talking about the broad outline of the market in general, you know, a well-traded market. That's what we're talking about. So yeah, some individual might not value it, but this still will, what my model, my theory will still explain it. Carl Menger, so those of you who have been through HET II already know that Carl Menger has a really nice refutation of this kind of an idea. And he says, why do cigars have value? Cigars have value because people like to smoke. And because people like to smoke, therefore, cigar rolling skills, the labor, or tobacco stocks, or the factories, or whatever, therefore, they have value. And what happens if tomorrow everybody decides they're against smoking and stops smoking? Cigars have 0 value now. And therefore, those higher order goods that are used to make cigars either lose all their value or they go to their next best use, which will be less. Okay? So in fact, the subjectivity of value really just wrecks this. But that's not the first point. Another one that someone pointed out is, what about technology? Because as we add, you can say, technological advance, as you get more and more capital and more advanced technology and more, your labor value can create more. Your labor creates more. It's not a constant fixed thing. Okay? Karl Marx actually recognizes this and yet doesn't. Karl Marx is one of these guys who's really smart and really stupid, because and that's a very common thing, that people will be really smart and they can't put 2 and 2 together. It happens to everybody, I suppose. But technology, those 2 are not the criticisms that are leveled at Ricardo in his time. The first one, though, is, what about heterogeneous labor? What is heterogeneous labor? The heterogeneity of labor, well, it's not all the same. A ditch digger and a brain surgeon have different kinds of labor. They're different goods. You can't say that how do you translate from one to the other? And this theory assumes there's an abstract unit of labor, an abstract average unit of labor. But there is no such thing. Nobody can ever figure it out. It does not exist. Remember that long quote, I read it for a reason, from Adam Smith, where he said something about, Smith goes on about how the one thing that's constant, a man laying down his ease, it is always the same thing. It's always another hour of labor. It never changes from time and place. Well, yes, it does. Why do you assert that? It's just not the same. It's different kinds of labor, different things. There is no such thing as this. The other problem is, I will give a long-winded story here, differing durabilities and lengths of production process. It's supposed to say lengths of production processes. Or if I don't want to be quite so wordy, I just say, what about the problem of time? Time upsets the whole apple cart here, even if you have homogeneous labor, even if it's all the same. I'm going to show you here. Now, I gave you this example right here. We're going to work with this a little bit more. We're going to add the time dimension. Once in a while, I have lost a whole class where they were like, we don't know what happened. What are you talking about? We didn't understand anything. But you guys will understand, right? Right. Okay. Let's make that happen. All right. This is actually pretty simple because we're going to use two different projects. It'll still be 100 units of labor in a machine to make 1,000 shirts, or 100 units of labor, etc. All those things, but we're going to put them now add a time dimension to it. And so project A takes 200 units of labor to make wheat, or to grow wheat, and project B will take 200 units of labor to make 1,000 shirts. That's 2 tons. And of course, Ricardo has told us 2 tons of wheat should trade for 1,000 shirts. Oh yeah, we'll find out. Here's project A, and this is year 1. We have to add the time dimension. This is year 2. And in year 1, with project A, we hire 100 units of labor, and we get 1 ton of wheat. Okay, great. And then in year 2, we take our next 100 units of labor and produce another 1 ton of wheat. So we got our 2 tons of wheat, 1 this year, 1 next year. Cool. Okay, great. 2 tons output. And then project B, we have 100 units of labor, and we produce our 1 unit of capital, our machine. And then here we take, year 2, we take 100 units of labor plus our 1 unit of capital that we made, and we get our 1,000 shirts. And Ricardo assures us they should trade for the same amount. Oh, really? There's a problem here. And here's the problem. Once I produce this, suppose that we always earn a 10% rate of profit. Okay? Great. That 10% rate of profit can be measured in terms of labor, right? And we're measuring everything in terms of labor here. So our 10% profit means that our profit is equal to, that when we sell that wheat in year 1, 10 units of labor, right? Oh, wow, I've got an extra 10. I can invest it. And what does that mean? When I invest that, I'll get an extra 1 unit of labor of profit in year 11, plus my 10 off that. Right? Right? Yes? I don't want to lose you right now. If you didn't follow what I said, tell me. Is it clear? No. Yes?
So we're assuming 10% profit, and so that 100 comes, or that 10 comes out.
Yeah, that's worth 100 units of labor, and what's 10% of 10? 10. 10% of 100 is 10. And so I just measured that's my profit. I just measured it in terms of labor.
And so in the second year, why is profit equal to 1?
Because I got profit from, I reinvest that, because I got paid then. I reinvest that and earn 10% off of that, and 10% off that, which means my total profit must be equal to 21 over all that time, right?
Oh, I see.
Right.
Oh.
Okay. Right here, I just keep the machine. I didn't use it. I got profit is equal to 0. Okay, and then he's telling me that here, when I sell that stuff, I get profit of equal to 20. And I'm looking at this, I'm going, I'm investing in wheat. I'm not going to produce any shirts. It's got to produce more. I mean, it's got to have something extra. Or I'm not going to, if I'm just getting paid for the labor input, why would I do that? I get paid more there because I get paid sooner and can reinvest, right? Taking that time into account. Make sense? Kate? Okay. Drew? Make sense? Okay. All right. Good. Everybody satisfied? Happy? Excited? Something? Entertained? I don't know about that part, but I am. That's all that matters. Where were we? So, great. Well, what does that mean? That means that nobody would invest in this, everybody would invest in that, unless this somehow paid more because it had a longer duration before you get you got to be paid for. One critic, Malthus, points both these things out. Malthus says heterogeneous labor sinks your theory, and this duration problem sinks your labor theory of value. And another economist, Nassau Senior, I've got him written over here, but I'll write him here. Another economist, classical economist, who is basically a Ricardian, but Nassau Senior says, yes, this theory can't quite be right. There's got to be something more going on. And he comes up with a theory of, as he calls it, abstinence. Abstinence means that the capitalist abstains from consumption. He could consume earlier. You know, he could get this right now and consume it, for example. And he abstains from consumption. He invests. He saves and invests. I should say it, put it that way. Saves and invests. And this needs to be paid for waiting. Great. These things are sinking the labor theory of value. They're problems to the labor theory of value. Okay? Great. Well, this is all pointed out to Ricardo, and he says, uh-oh. Basically, he says, you're right. These are problems for my theory. He then says, it's still, my theory is pretty good. It may not be exact, but it's as close as anybody has come to a good theory of value. It sort of works. It seems like it makes sense, kinda. And he says it may not be strictly accurate, but it's still a pretty good measure of exchange value. And then he says the labor production in gold, labor input in gold production tends to be quite stable. So maybe we can just say that gold is the measure, and it works out as a measure of labor, and it's like lots of arm waving, and in fact, it's wrong. Okay? George Stiegler says that Ricardo has a 92% theory. He has a paper, David Ricardo's 92% labor theory of value, because he thinks it's roughly approximate, not exact. This is as good as he can get. So, make sense? Or questions? Or okay. Malthus is very big on the idea of demand. He thinks that demand has to be implemented here, but doesn't. Well, the labor theory of value is a mistake. It's an error. I should probably say something else about it too. Is that where does this all go? Well, Nassau Senior says abstinence. Capitalist has to be paid. Karl Marx takes the labor theory of value and says it's exactly right. It is true. And you know what it means? It means that not only are the rents a residual, but so are the profits. Profits are stolen. Everything is created by labor, and everything should go to the laborer. Time to overthrow the system. Basically, his argument here.
Just in the project example.
Yeah.
Wouldn't in theory, like the company or whatever making the machine be one company or something? And
Yeah.
making the shirts would be separate, and therefore, over time, the machine with the labor would be producing the same amount of capital or same amount of profit.
So what you're saying is, suppose that I sold it to somebody else and they paid it right there,
Yeah,
and then, okay, but then at this while I can tell that story, they're not getting any output until, the point is that this starts out here in year 1 and doesn't get any final output, which is where the ultimate final good value is generated. Okay? So somebody is borrowing or loaning or something in that story. That make sense?
Yep.
Okay.
All right, I forgot, where does the 1L come from on your two?
Sure. I should have written that down. I'm going to assume a 10% rate of profit. If there's a 10% rate of profit, just for example, and I can measure value in terms of labor, then I've got 100 units of labor. That profit from the 1 ton of wheat must be equivalent to 10 units of labor, the amount of money that would be equivalent to 10 units of labor. And that, when I invest it, will earn 10% profit, which is where the 1L comes from there. Okay? Great. They can't pay, I mean, the point is, this will have to have some way of getting that up to that. Okay? And that will be some sort of an interest payment is what abstinence is really supposed to be capturing. Okay? That makes sense? And that makes sense for your question too. Yeah. Okay, good.
So when you say Nassau Senior says that capitalists need to be paid for waiting,
Mm-hmm.
is he saying? Like,
It's an interest payment.
Yeah, like the government should do that?
No. The market somehow does this. It's an interest payment. Not the government does it, it's the market. He said that Ricardo has tried to claim that this is what is happening in the market. And he says, no, it's not, it can't be. That must be some other sort of an additional thing going on here. People are not just being paid for the amount of labor that is going on there, but it's something else, other factors, other things happening. That's it. He's not saying government should do it. He's saying that that's what the market. Ricardo just told a wrong story. His theory isn't right. Okay? Cool. All right. Well, good. Let's proceed. Because the labor theory of value is a mistake. And yet, Ricardo is so smart, he uses it to generate a brilliant insight, and that's into international trade. Because labor theory of value requires the rate of profit to be the same across industries. And we already know that if not, capital will leave one industry and move to the other, just as labor will move from one to the other, so that these rates of profit will equalize and get this story to work out. What about international borders where you can't move capital or labor, or can't move them easily? What determines trade between countries? And Ricardo says, now we will develop the theory of comparative cost. And if you treat labor as being cost of production, if you just think of that, what he's really talking about is cost of production stories, and his whole insight will start making sense, even though he's a little bit wrong here. His mistaken theory of value still works to illustrate this. And so let's look at law of comparative advantage and develop that. Because this is a brilliant, I think, insight. And I'm going to give you some details on it that you might not be familiar with. So we'll keep Ricardo up here. He deserves that. And we'll just call it the law of comparative advantage. The law of. And I'm going to emphasize it, this is a law. This is not something arbitrary or anything else. And I have heard politics professors saying, oh, economists are all wrong, the law of comparative advantage is. Okay, there are reasons why you might not want to have completely free trade with China or some enemy country. But it's not because that doesn't show that the law of comparative advantage is wrong. It's not wrong, it's a law. It would be, if you want to have valid criticisms of some policy, at least you should understand the laws of reality they're dictating. Now, at the time Ricardo is writing, everybody knows that if England is really good at one thing and Portugal is really good at the other thing, they should trade, right? You're better, England's better at cloth, Portugal's better than England at wine, trade cloth for wine. But what if Portugal is better than everything? I know, if you're English, that's hard to believe. My Brazilian friends tell me it's really hard to believe that Portugal could do anything right. The Portuguese apparently like to make fun of, or the Brazilians make fun of the Portuguese or something. But here's the story. Remember that Smith, I'm going to start out with Smith and absolute advantage. And Smith's story was something like this. We'll put England on this and Portugal here, and we will have these kind of constant cost assumptions. And so we'll put, what are my goods? 1 bolt of cloth and 1 cask of wine. I guess wine comes in casks. And I'm going to put there are different ways of representing these matrices. I want you to do it this way. This will be on the final exam. And you'll be asked, you'll be required to get one of these and know how to solve it. I'll give you a problem so you can practice with them. But here's how we're going to do it. We're going to put the cost of one, there are other ways of doing this, but in this matrix, we'll put the cost to England of a bolt of cloth, and let's say that that's 2 units of labor. And the Portuguese, it's 20 units of labor. England's really good at making cloth, and the Portuguese are not very good. They're 10, they're a tenth of the labor, 10th of the cost. And then 1 cask of wine. The English take 300 units of labor, and these guys take only 10 units of labor. Oh, for heaven's sakes. The English are no good at wine. They're really good at wine. Guess what? Portugal produces wine, England produces cloth, and they trade. And Adam Smith says, see, they can both be better off. Okay, but wait a minute. What if England is what if Portugal's better at everything? Let's change those numbers. And this is Ricardo. I guess we know it's Ricardo, but this is going to be the story of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage. And so for 1 bolt of cloth, England takes 100 units of labor, and Portugal takes 90. Oh, Portugal's better at cloth than England. And what about 100 for wine? It's 120 units of labor and 80 units of labor. Oh, Portugal's also better at wine. Portugal's better at everything. I guess they can't trade. No, don't say that. I once had a student, I shouldn't tell this story on video, but once had a student on the final exam in this class turn in his exam, and he was graduating in December, and he hands in the exam, and he walks out of the room, and I pick it up, and he says, oh, he has a matrix like that, and he says, well, obviously they can't trade. There's no way they could profitably trade. They shouldn't trade. They should just close their borders. And I'm looking at this and thinking, once I tell Wolfram and Pongrasic, they're going to hunt him down and kill him. Unless I get him first. A little bit later, before I was just aghast at what I was reading, and then I suddenly got an email from this guy. I think I might have made a mistake. Don't make that mistake. Okay, you can always trade. I don't care if this put the million and 120 million or whatever there. They will be able to trade no matter how bad one is relative to the other. They can find profitable trades. Okay, you should be able to show that. In fact, let's talk about why this is. They have absolute advantage at everything, but they don't have comparative advantage. And what's comparative advantage? Comparative advantage is, he asks, what is the opportunity cost of making one thing? That is, not the labor cost, but the opportunity, cost of making something. That is, what else could I have done with that labor? And I can describe that by something like this. The price of wine in England over the price of, and that's going to be the labor input, of course. The price of cloth in England is going to tell me how much cloth I forego instead of producing a unit of wine, right? Okay? Great. Well, let's see what we can do with this. we're going to take that and turn this into, okay, I've got the cost of production there in each country, but I'm going to now look at the opportunity cost. So I'll just abbreviate this way, the opportunity cost of 1 bolt of cloth or 1 cask of wine in England or Portugal. And that 100 units of labor, if I produce a unit of cloth, could have been devoted to wine production, right? So it looks like that should be 100 divided by 120, which I think is about 100 over 120 should be equal to about, it's something approximately something like that, I think. Okay? On the other hand, if I take that 120 units of labor and produce a cask of wine, I could have done 1 bolt of cloth plus another 2/10 of a bolt of cloth, right? Right. That is to say, 1.2 cloth, and I should have written right there wine. That's that's how much. If I make a bolt of cloth, I gave up that much wine I could have made. If I make a cask of wine, I gave up that much cloth I could have made if I'm England. And similarly here, for Portugal, it must be, obviously, it must be 90 over 80, which is something like 1.125 wine. And then over here, it should be 0.88 cloth, right? I just invert that. That's 80 over 90. Okay? Yes? Clear? Okay. If a few people say it's clear to them and everybody else is going, I have no idea what you're doing, I won't know it unless you tell me. But it's clear? Good. Awesome. We've got the opportunity cost there. Who is the low-cost producer of wine? Well, they give up 1.2 cloth. They give up, oh, they are. Who's the low-cost producer of cloth? They are. Trade. Now we have our trade, right? That is to say, think of it this way. England wants wine. They have 2 choices. Either they produce a cask of wine themselves and give up that much cloth, or they somehow get the Portuguese to give them wine, and they will do that if they can get the Portuguese to accept less than 1.2 units of cloth for their wine. Would the Portuguese accept less than 1.2 units of cloth? Well, it would cost them to make cloth, what would they? To make a cask of wine, it costs them that much cloth. If you pay them more cloth than that, it's a good deal for them, right? Yes, I think so. And in fact, there's a whole range of prices over which they could trade. And Ricardo says, why don't we just make this one simple and note that one possible set of prices would be 1 cloth trading for 1 unit of wine. Both sides will be better off. Okay, that's his insight. Cool. So there are other possible prices that could appear there, but he says just assume a nice simple one that's easy. So it doesn't answer exactly how this price would be determined or how the gains would be distributed, but it's a big advance. You can see that, okay? Because we don't need absolute advantage anymore to describe anything that's happening. And great. So it's not a complete theory, but it's most of it. He doesn't tell us what determines the price. John Stuart Mill, who comes along not too long after, actually comes up with a story that will develop an actual price, international prices. Okay, that's the heart of modern trade theory. And together, Adam Smith and David Ricardo have just killed mercantilism. The mercantilist zero-sum story is just wrong. It's just wrong. That's all there is to it. There might be reasons you don't want to buy all of your military technology from all your military electronics and computer supplies from China, but it's not because comparative advantage doesn't work. It's because you don't want the Chinese to have our planes crash and our missiles come back at us if we get in war with them or something. Okay? Now, I'm telling you that I'm going to give you something like that on the final exam. You'll be expected to come up with something like that and find a price at which they can trade. No guarantee that it's 1-to-1 ratio. It might be something else. It might be 2-to-1, or I don't know. Maybe that range wouldn't make sense with a problem. But I'll give you a practice problem or something so you can do it. Know this, because you need to understand comparative advantage and that it is really a law. It's not just some arbitrary prejudice of economists. Okay? And again, there might be some arguments where you don't want to trade for some reason, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't hold. It just means that you have to bear those costs. That's the story. Okay? Cool. Should I say more about it? Yes, I think I should. Because this is something where many economists with PhDs kind of lose track for a second and get confused. Because the law of comparative advantage is not a general theory of trade. Suppose that England and Portugal are all one country, okay? Then what? Don't look at this right now. Just think of England and Portugal being all one country, okay? And you have labor. Where do you want to put it? Where is it more productive? Portugal. You want to put all your labor in Portugal, right? Why would you put any labor in England? Because you wouldn't unless Portugal somehow was all filled and now you're moving into the next less fertile or less valuable area. Oh, that's the theory of the extensive margin, right? If it's all one country and there are no borders, you don't need the law of comparative advantage to explain the trade patterns or the production patterns. It's absolute advantage and the theory of the extensive margin. That's what Ricardo says. If you're reading Human Action by Ludwig von Mises, when he's talking about Ricardo's law of comparative cost, as he calls it, he's got this cryptic little section in the book where he says, however, the law of, sort of says, the law of comparative advantage might not hold in the future, it might not be relevant, rather, under certain circumstances, and people read that and often just skip over it. What's he talking about? What he's saying in that spot is that suppose that we entered a world where there were no borders, where capital and labor flowed totally freely, well then it wouldn't matter, it'd just be the theory of the extensive margin. Why don't you grow wheat on top of the Rocky Mountains? There are places in the Rockies, I've been there this year, where you could definitely grow wheat. But it's just outside the extensive margin. It's like you wouldn't get a very good crop. Why waste any time there when you can grow wheat down in, Nebraska, Kansas, and the better parts of Montana? But this is in Montana. It's like, I don't know how high we were, 6,000, 7,000 feet or something, and scrub grass and stuff. You could grow wheat there if you wanted to. But it's outside the extensive margin. Why would you waste time there? Well, if wheat became valuable enough and we expanded cultivation enough, you could, okay? But it's not comparative advantage story that does that, okay? That's the internal story is something else. When you guys when you first heard about law of comparative advantage, what examples were given to you? It was probably in principles class. What was it? What?
You're on an island and like you're getting coconuts or fish or whatever, so you trade.
So you had, is that Butters?
And that was Dr. Martin.
Everybody was apparently using these island examples, which are like, island? Oh, well, whatever. So, I don't know. I always used the well, it was because of the textbook I used to use, but the electrician and the carpenter trading jobs and stuff like this, working for each other. But there are various kinds of stories. Like there's one about the professional basketball player who is also an excellent word processing typist, He's really good at both, but he's so much better he hires somebody who's not nearly as good at typing as he is to write his memoirs or his book about basketball or whatever, because he's got a comparative advantage works for individuals. Because again, I can't take my skill, strictly speaking, and put it into you, nor you back and forth. Skills don't migrate that way, right? So it works on the international, comparative advantage works on the international level and on the individual level. Okay. Wow. I always thought the basketball story was interesting because it turned out that, and I'm not sure who it was, there was some player for the Lakers who used to win speed typing contests. And he actually hired a secretary to do his memoirs. So it was a real world example. But at any rate, cool. What do we have, 5 minutes? Well, let me just draw one final implication out of all this, or something, out of all this comparative advantage stuff. And that is that when you think about what Ricardo has just done, it means that prices in the international market aren't really explained by labor theory of value, and cost of production and price will depend upon demand, which has been ignored, largely ignored in classical economics, except really by Malthus and a few people like that. But here's the idea. Suppose that, okay, let's just go ahead and convert this story. Each one has 100 units of labor, let's say. And I'm going to invent the world production possibility frontier. If those are our two countries and each has 100 units of labor, okay, well, if the Portuguese have 100 units of labor, let's put wine on this axis and cloth on this axis. If the Portuguese have 100 units of labor, they can produce 1 cask of wine plus another, what is it, 210? Yeah, it looks like 1.25, right? Yes. And these guys, if they have 100 units of labor, can produce, I think that comes to 0.83. Yeah. So that would mean the Portuguese could produce, with their 100 units of labor, 1.25. The Brits could do 0.83. And so that would mean that point right there, if the world was only producing wine, put all their labor to that, it's 2.08, right? And similarly, if they produced nothing but cloth, the English put their 100 units of labor into that, they'd get 1 unit of cloth. And these guys would get about 1.1? Yeah. And so that would mean about 1.1. And then if you were producing, if you decided to produce less than only, if you do some cloth, where would you produce it? England, or if you're right there and then you say, wait a minute, that's too much wine, we want some cloth, where would you produce the cloth? Which country? No, the one that's good, that's cheaper, where you give up less. That's that you produce the cloth in England, right? So going at this, you go something like, anyway, I'll just draw this really fast because we're low on time. But there's our production possibility frontier. And at this point right here, England is producing nothing but cloth, and Portugal producing nothing but wine. I think that comes to 1.25. Yep. Okay, great. To be 1, not 100. Great. And so that would give us our world production possibility frontier. That's supposedly a straight line. Does that make sense, what I've just told you? Yes? Okay. I think that's actually, I think I meant to write 2.1 right there. Great. So it's going to have a kink in it, so to speak. Now, I don't like drawing like a group indifference curve or anything, a social indifference curve. But look, that's how I'm going to represent demand. If demand happens to be higher for wine than cloth, relatively speaking, that's going to be the price on the world market, the rate at which those things change. But if demand is relatively higher for cloth than for wine, we'd be down here and we'd have a different price, potential price on the international market, right? Okay, different ratio. And so we can see that the cost of production at the margin is going to be determined in part by demand. And prices are going to be determined in part by demand. And Ricardo doesn't fully get all that. We lay that out. Okay, So we're starting to see some of the flaws, both the brilliance and still some of the flaws. The labor theory of value is a problem for classical economics, becomes a weak spot. That's the weak spot at which it will be broken when we get to HET II, if you're around for that. Well, there we go. There's Ricardo. Enormous accomplishments. He's the lead claim to the inventor of the marginal product theory and marginal analysis. In diminishing marginal product, he develops economics as a method of rigorous analysis, modern trade theory. His labor theory of value is flawed, but he has economic defenses of free markets, free trade, laissez-faire. He's a very important economist and classical liberal reformer. Wow. And so his immediate legacy is that he has made this a real discipline that then catches on. Now, we're out of time, like 20 seconds. I'll simply say that I'll be on video, but I don't care. I'm just pissed as can be that I have to stop and that you guys don't get to come back. Because the best thing about Hillsdale is getting to lecture to you guys. And so I appreciate it. I hope we get back together soon. Stay in touch and keep going. And we'll see your term papers soon. All right.